In 1936, thousands of German workers gathered at the Blohm+Voss shipyard in Hamburg for what appeared to be a routine Nazi ceremony. Arms shot up in perfect synchronization as Adolf Hitler's voice echoed across the crowd. But in that sea of raised hands, one man stood defiantly still, his arms crossed, his face set in quiet rebellion. August Landmesser became an accidental symbol of resistance, captured in a single devastating photograph. This wasn't just a moment of defiance. It was a death sentence he didn't know he was signing. What happened to August Landmesser reveals the true cost of standing against one of history's most ruthless regimes. His story, and the stories of others who dared to refuse Nazi authority, exposes the brutal machinery that turned ordinary citizens into victims, heroes, and casualties of conscience. August Landmesser wasn't born a rebel. Born in 1910 in Moorrede, a small town in northern Germany, he grew up in a working-class family during some of the most turbulent years in German history. His father worked as a farm laborer, and young August learned early that survival meant keeping your head down and doing whatever work was available. When the Great Depression hit Germany like a sledgehammer in 1929, Landmesser was just 19 years old and struggling to find steady employment. The economic collapse had thrown 6 million Germans out of work, and young men like August faced a future with no prospects, no stability, and no hope. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that the Nazi Party began to seem like an answer. In 1931, August Landmesser made a decision that millions of Germans made during those dark years. He joined the Nazi Party. This wasn't ideological conviction speaking. This was survival instinct. Party membership opened doors to employment, provided a sense of belonging, and offered the promise of a better future for Germany and for himself. Landmesser found work at the Blohm+Voss shipyard in Hamburg, one of Germany's largest shipbuilding companies. The work was hard, dangerous, and poorly paid, but it was work. He welded steel, operated machinery, and gradually built a life for himself in the bustling port city. For a few years, everything seemed to be working out exactly as the Nazi propaganda had promised. But then, August Landmesser met Irma Eckler, and everything changed. Irma was Jewish. In 1933, when they first met, this was becoming an increasingly dangerous fact in Germany, but it wasn't yet the death sentence it would later become. They fell in love the way young people do, completely, recklessly, without thinking about the consequences that were gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. By 1935, those consequences had arrived with the force of law. The Nuremberg laws, passed in September of that year, didn't just make marriage between Germans and Jews illegal, they made love itself a criminal act. Relationships between Germans and Jews were now classified as race defilement, punishable by years in prison. August and Irma were already deeply involved by this point. More than that, Irma was pregnant with their first child. The couple found themselves trapped between love and law, between their hearts and a regime that had made their feelings a crime punishable by imprisonment. Landmesser applied for permission to marry Irma, hoping that somehow the bureaucratic machinery of the Nazi state might make an exception, might find a loophole that would allow them to legitimize their relationship and protect their unborn child. The application was rejected without explanation. The Nazi Party expelled him immediately for dishonoring the race. This is the context that makes the famous photograph so powerful. When August Landmesser stood in that crowd on June 13, 1936, refusing to raise his arm in salute, he wasn't making a grand political statement. He was a man who had already lost everything the Nazi system claimed to offer: party membership, economic security, social acceptance, and legal protection for his family. His crossed arms weren't a calculated act of resistance. They were the posture of a man who had nothing left to lose, and no reason to pretend loyalty to a system that had declared his love criminal and his family illegitimate. The launch of the naval training vessel Horst Wessel on June 13, 1936, was meant to be a showcase of Nazi power and German industrial might. Thousands of shipyard workers gathered to hear speeches from Nazi officials, to witness the launch of this impressive warship, and to demonstrate their loyalty to the regime through coordinated displays of support. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, was there to document the event. His cameras captured the massive crowd, the impressive ship, and the sea of raised arms that demonstrated the apparent unity of the German people behind their leader, It was supposed to be perfect propaganda material. But when the photographs were developed and examined, something extraordinary had been captured. In frame after frame showing thousands of people with raised arms, one figure stood out like a wound in the fabric of conformity. August Landmesser, arms firmly crossed, looking not at the speaker, but slightly to the side, as if he couldn't bear to watch the performance unfolding around him. The photograph wasn't published at the time. It would have been impossible to use it as propaganda when it so clearly showed someone refusing to participate in the Nazi ritual. Instead, it was filed away in the archives, a piece of evidence that the supposed unity of the German people wasn't quite as complete as the regime claimed. But photographs have a way of surviving, and this image eventually found its way into history books as one of the most powerful examples of individual resistance to fascism. What makes it so compelling isn't just the visual impact of one man standing against thousands. It's the knowledge of what that stance cost him. Standing in that crowd, Landmesser couldn't have known that his refusal to salute was being photographed. He wasn't performing for posterity or trying to send a message to future generations. He was simply a man who couldn't bring himself to pledge allegiance to a system that had destroyed his life and threatened his family. However, he had no idea that this single act of defiance would soon cost him everything. After his expulsion from the Nazi Party, August Landmesser's situation became increasingly desperate. His employment at the shipyard was now precarious. Party membership wasn't technically required for all jobs, but employers were increasingly reluctant to hire anyone who had fallen out of favor with the regime. His relationship with Irma was not just socially unacceptable, but legally dangerous for both of them. Their daughter Ingrid was born in 1935, a beautiful, healthy child who represented both hope and terror for her parents. Under Nazi law, Ingrid was classified as a Mischling, a person of mixed race, who occupied a liminal space in the regime's racial hierarchy. She wasn't Jewish enough to face immediate persecution, but she wasn't German enough to enjoy full protection under Nazi law. As 1936 turned into 1937, the situation for Jewish families in Germany was deteriorating rapidly. The initial boycotts and legal restrictions were giving way to more aggressive persecution. Jewish businesses were being forcibly closed. Jewish children were being expelled from schools, and Jewish families were facing increasing pressure to emigrate if they could find anywhere that would accept them. August and Irma watched these developments with growing alarm. They could see where things were heading, and they knew that their family was directly in the path of the Nazi steamroller. Irma was pregnant again, which only added to their sense of urgency. They needed to get out of Germany before the situation became completely impossible. In early 1937, they made their move. Denmark seemed like their best option. It was close, it was relatively liberal, and it had historically been friendly to refugees. The plan was simple: travel to the Danish border, cross into Denmark, and request asylum as a family fleeing persecution. The plan failed catastrophically. Border security had been dramatically increased as the Nazi regime became more paranoid about people fleeing Germany. The authorities were particularly suspicious of mixed couples, knowing that many were trying to escape before the racial laws made their situations completely untenable. August and Irma were arrested at the border before they could even attempt to cross. The charges were serious: attempting to flee the Reich, violating racial laws, and undermining state authority. For a regime that was increasingly obsessed with control and obedience, their escape attempt represented multiple forms of defiance that couldn't be ignored. The arrest separated them immediately. This was standard procedure for mixed couples. The German partner and the Jewish partner faced different legal processes and different potential punishments. August was charged with race defilement and attempting to flee, crimes that carried significant prison sentences. Irma faced charges related to her status as a Jew in an illegal relationship, but her pregnancy complicated the legal situation. The Nazi bureaucracy was nothing if not thorough in its cruelty. Even as they separated the couple and prepared to prosecute them, officials meticulously documented every aspect of their case. The paperwork survives in German archives, providing a detailed record of how the Nazi system processed individual acts of love and defiance. The Nazi legal system that processed August Landmesser and Irma Eckler was designed not just to punish individual crimes, but to systematically destroy relationships and families that didn't conform to racial ideology. Their case provides a window into how this machinery operated at the most personal level. August was sentenced to 2.5 years of hard labor, to be served in various work camps and prisons throughout northern Germany. The sentence was carefully calculated, long enough to be punishing, but not so long as to make him a martyr or attract unwanted attention. The regime wanted to break him, not create a symbol of resistance. The conditions in Nazi labor camps were deliberately harsh. Prisoners worked long hours with minimal food, inadequate clothing, and constant supervision. The work was often pointless, moving rocks from one pile to another, digging ditches that would be filled in the next day, or performing other tasks designed more to break the spirit than to accomplish anything useful. But August's punishment went beyond physical hardship. Throughout his imprisonment, he received no information about Irma or their children. He didn't know where she was being held, what charges she faced, or what was happening to Ingrid. This uncertainty was part of the punishment. The Nazi system understood that not knowing was often worse than knowing the worst. Meanwhile, Irma was transferred to Oranienburg concentration camp, one of the earliest camps established by the Nazi regime. Oranienburg was located just north of Berlin and initially housed political prisoners. But by 1937, it was also being used to imprison people who had violated racial laws. The conditions at Oranienburg were brutal, even by the standards of the early concentration camp system. Prisoners lived in overcrowded barracks, received starvation rations, and faced constant harassment from guards who had been selected for their willingness to treat prisoners as less than human. Irma gave birth to her second daughter, Irene, while imprisoned at Oranienburg. Think about that for a moment. A woman giving birth in a concentration camp, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, bringing a child into a world that had already classified that child as undesirable simply for existing. The birth records from Oranienburg show that Irene was born in December 1937, healthy despite the terrible conditions her mother endured during pregnancy. But the same records also show that mother and child were classified as protective custody prisoners, a euphemism the Nazis used to justify indefinite imprisonment without trial. What happened next reveals the particular cruelty that the Nazi system reserved for families. Instead of allowing Irma to keep her newborn daughter with her, camp officials took Irene away and placed her in foster care with a German family. The justification was that the concentration camp was no place for a child, but the real purpose was to ensure that Jewish mothers could form no bonds with their children. Ingrid, the older daughter, was also removed from any contact with her imprisoned mother and placed in a different foster home. The two sisters, barely toddlers, were separated from each other and from any knowledge of their parents' fate. The Nazi system had effectively erased their family, scattering its members across Germany and ensuring that they might never find each other again. August Landmesser's experience in Nazi labor camps between 1937 and 1941 illustrates how the regime used imprisonment not just to punish, but to systematically break down the personalities and relationships of those who had defied its authority. He was moved frequently between different facilities, a deliberate policy designed to prevent prisoners from forming relationships or organizing resistance. Every few months, just as he was beginning to adapt to one set of conditions and fellow prisoners, he would be transferred to a new location with new rules and new forms of harassment. The work assignments varied but shared a common theme of pointless brutality. In one camp, he spent months quarrying stone that was never used for construction. In another, he worked in a factory producing goods for the war effort, his labor contributing to a military machine that was simultaneously destroying his family and his country. The guards at these facilities had been selected and trained to view prisoners as enemies of the state, who deserved whatever treatment they received. Physical violence was common, but psychological torture was constant. Prisoners were forced to stand at attention for hours, denied adequate food and medical care, and subjected to random punishments for infractions that might be as minor as looking at a guard the wrong way. Letters were strictly censored, and prisoners were allowed to send only brief, pre-approved messages to family members. August's attempts to learn about Irma and his daughters were consistently blocked. When he asked guards or administrators about his family's status, he was told that such information was none of his concern. The isolation was perhaps the worst part of the punishment. August had no way of knowing whether Irma was still alive, whether his daughters were safe, or what was happening in the outside world. The Nazi system understood that uncertainty could be more devastating than any physical punishment, and they used this knowledge ruthlessly. Other prisoners in the labor camps came from all walks of life and had been imprisoned for various offenses against Nazi authority. There were political dissidents who had spoken out against the regime, Jehovah's Witnesses who had refused to abandon their faith, homosexual men who had been caught violating Nazi morality laws, and other men, like August, who had been caught in relationships with Jewish women. These prisoners formed a shadow community within the camp system, sharing information, resources, and support when possible. August learned that he wasn't alone, that thousands of other Germans were being punished for refusing to conform to Nazi ideology in various ways. But he also learned that the fate of their families was often worse than their own. Stories circulated among the prisoners about wives and children who had disappeared into the concentration camp system, about families that had been completely destroyed by Nazi racial policies, and about people who had simply vanished without any record of what had happened to them. These stories weren't shared to provide comfort. They were shared as warnings about what the Nazi system was capable of doing to anyone who crossed it. As the years passed, August's hope of being reunited with his family began to fade. The letters he was allowed to send received no responses. His applications for information about Irma's status were ignored or denied. The bureaucratic machinery that had once processed his marriage application now seemed designed to ensure that he would never again have contact with the woman he loved or the children he had helped create. When August Landmesser was finally released from prison in January 1941, he stepped into a Germany that had been completely transformed by war and Nazi ideology. The country he had known before his imprisonment had disappeared, replaced by a militarized police state focused entirely on conquest and racial purification. The changes weren't subtle. Every aspect of German society had been regimented and militarized. Rationing was in effect. Blackout curtains covered windows at night, and the population lived under constant surveillance. Most dramatically for August, the persecution of Jews had escalated from legal discrimination to systematic deportation and murder. His first priority was finding information about Irma and his daughters. The bureaucratic maze he encountered reveals how the Nazi system had perfected the art of making people disappear without officially acknowledging what had happened to them. At the local registration office, he was told that Irma's records had been transferred to other authorities. When he contacted those authorities, he was told that information about prisoners was classified and unavailable to former prisoners. When he tried to find out about his daughters through child welfare services, he was told that foster care arrangements were confidential and that he had no legal standing to request information. Every avenue he pursued led to a dead end, but not a definitive one. Officials never told him directly that Irma was dead or that his daughters had been permanently removed from his custody. Instead, they created a bureaucratic labyrinth designed to exhaust his resources and break his spirit while maintaining plausible deniability about what had actually happened to his family. What August gradually pieced together through fragments of information and rumors was that Irma had been transferred from Oranienburg to Ravensbrück concentration camp sometime in 1939. Ravensbrück was a camp specifically designed for women, and by 1941, it had become a key site in the Nazi program of systematic murder. The records that survive from Ravensbrück paint a picture of escalating brutality as the war progressed. What had begun as a prison camp for political dissidents and other undesirables had evolved into a killing facility where prisoners were selected for death based on their ability to work, their health status, and the regime's changing needs for labor versus elimination. Irma Eckler's name appears on transport lists from Ravensbrück to the Bernburg Euthanasia Center in early 1942. Bernburg was one of several facilities established under the Nazi euthanasia program, initially used to murder disabled individuals, but later expanded to kill concentration camp prisoners who were considered unfit for work. The process at Bernburg was designed to be efficient and secret. Prisoners were told they were being transferred for medical treatment or to a different type of facility. They were loaded onto buses with painted-over windows and driven to what looked like a medical facility. There, they were led into rooms disguised as shower facilities and murdered with carbon monoxide gas. The entire process, from arrival to death to cremation, took less than 24 hours. The families of victims were sent form letters stating that their relative had died suddenly of illness and had been cremated for health reasons. No bodies were returned, no possessions were preserved, and no records were kept that would allow later identification of the victims. Irma Eckler was murdered at Bernburg in February 1942, along with dozens of other Ravensbrück prisoners who had been selected for elimination. Her death was recorded in Nazi files as resulting from acute heart failure, a standard lie used to hide the reality of systematic murder. August never received official notification of Irma's death. His letters to authorities requesting information about her status simply stopped receiving responses. The bureaucratic machinery that had once provided hope, however false, simply fell silent. By 1944, August Landmesser had spent 3 years searching for information about his family, and 3 years living as a marked man in Nazi Germany. His criminal record made him unemployable in any official capacity. His social connections had been severed by his imprisonment, and his constant inquiries about Irma and his daughters had marked him as a persistent troublemaker in the eyes of local authorities. The Nazi regime was also facing its own crisis by 1944. Military losses on multiple fronts had created an enormous demand for soldiers, and the Wehrmacht was increasingly forced to draft men who had previously been considered unreliable or unsuitable for military service. This included political prisoners, criminals, and others who had been classified as enemies of the state. These men were organized into penal battalions, punishment units that were sent to the most dangerous fronts with minimal training, inadequate equipment, and the clear understanding that they were expendable. The logic behind penal battalions was brutally simple. Even men who couldn't be trusted with normal military responsibilities could still absorb enemy bullets and potentially inflict some damage on opposing forces before they died. Their deaths would serve the war effort, while also eliminating individuals who had proven themselves to be problems for the Nazi system. August Landmesser was drafted into Penal Battalion 999 in October 1944. This unit was composed entirely of political prisoners, criminals, and other men whom the Nazi regime considered unreliable but expendable. The battalion's unofficial motto, according to surviving members, was "probation through death." The idea that men could redeem themselves in the eyes of the state by dying in combat. The training for penal battalion members was minimal, just enough to teach them how to hold a rifle and follow basic orders. They were not taught advanced tactics, given adequate supplies, or provided with the support systems that regular Wehrmacht units received. They were given uniforms, weapons, and orders to fight until they died. Penal Battalion 999 was deployed to the Eastern Front in late 1944, as Soviet forces were pushing German armies back toward the borders of the Reich. The conditions on the Eastern Front were horrific even for regular German units. Bitter cold, constant combat, inadequate supplies, and an enemy that was fighting with the fury of a nation that had suffered enormous losses during the German invasion. For penal battalion members, these conditions were even worse. They were typically assigned to the most dangerous positions, sent on suicide missions, and used as expendable shock troops in desperate situations. Regular Wehrmacht units were often ordered to shoot penal battalion members who attempted to retreat, ensuring that their only options were death in combat or death by execution. The records of Penal Battalion 999 are fragmentary, but they show a unit that was systematically destroyed through combat losses and attrition. Of the approximately 1,000 men who served in the battalion during its existence, fewer than 200 survived the war. August Landmesser was declared missing in action in March 1945 during the final months of the war as German forces collapsed on all fronts. No body was ever recovered. No witnesses came forward to describe his final moments, and no records exist to explain exactly how or where he died. But the circumstances make the outcome clear. August Landmesser, the man who had refused to salute Hitler in 1936, was sent to die in a penal battalion in 1945. The Nazi system had taken 9 years to complete its revenge against him, but it had been thorough and systematic in its destruction of everything he cared about. While August was being systematically destroyed by the Nazi regime, his daughters Ingrid and Irene were growing up as wards of the state, their identities hidden and their family history erased. Their story reveals another dimension of Nazi cruelty: the deliberate destruction of family bonds, and the creation of a generation of children who grew up without knowing their own origins. Ingrid, born in 1935, was placed with a German family in Hamburg who were told only that she was the child of a criminal and needed to be raised as a proper German citizen. Her foster family was not told about her Jewish mother, her father's political status, or the circumstances that had led to her placement in their care. The foster family, the Meyers, were decent people who treated Ingrid well and provided her with a stable home environment. But they were also committed Nazis who believed they were doing their patriotic duty by raising a child who had been rescued from undesirable influences. They taught Ingrid to be proud of her German heritage, while never telling her that this heritage was only half of her actual identity. Irene, born in 1937 in Oranienburg concentration camp, was placed with a different family in a different city. The Nazi authorities deliberately separated the sisters to prevent them from maintaining any connection to each other or to their original family. Each girl grew up believing she was an only child with no living relatives. Both girls were given new names and new identities. Official records of their original names and family connections were classified or destroyed, making it virtually impossible for them to learn about their true origins, even if they had suspected that their foster families weren't their biological families. The foster families were instructed never to discuss the girls' origins with them or with anyone else. This wasn't just a matter of privacy, it was a state security issue. If the girls learned about their Jewish mother or their father's resistance activities, they might develop sympathies that would make them unreliable citizens of the Nazi state. As the girls grew older, they occasionally asked questions about their origins, as all children do. They were told various stories, that their parents had died in accidents, that they had been abandoned as infants, or that their backgrounds were too painful to discuss. These lies were presented as kindness, ways of protecting the girls from difficult truths. The psychological impact of this deception was profound. Both Ingrid and Irene grew up with a sense that something fundamental was missing from their lives, but they had no way to identify what it was or how to find it. They developed the hypervigilance and anxiety that often characterizes children who sense they're not being told the truth about important aspects of their lives. During the war years, both girls attended Nazi schools where they learned about racial theory, the importance of German racial purity, and the dangers posed by Jews and other undesirable groups. They participated in Nazi youth organizations, learned Nazi songs and slogans, and were taught to see themselves as members of the master race. The irony was devastating. Two girls whose mother had been murdered for being Jewish and whose father had been killed for refusing to support the Nazi regime were being raised as faithful Nazi supporters, completely unaware of their family's true story. When the war ended in 1945, the foster families faced a difficult decision. The Nazi regime had collapsed, and many of its policies were being reversed by the occupying Allied forces. Information about concentration camps and other Nazi crimes was becoming public, and there was growing awareness that many children had been forcibly separated from their families for political or racial reasons. The foster families could have revealed the truth about the girls' origins at this point, but they chose to maintain the deception. They had grown attached to the children and feared losing them if their true identities were revealed. They also worried that the girls would be traumatized by learning about their parents' fates. So Ingrid and Irene continued to grow up believing the lies they had been told about their origins. They finished their educations, found jobs, married, and started families of their own, never knowing that they were sisters or that their parents had been victims of the Nazi regime they had been raised to support. While August Landmesser's story was unfolding in Hamburg, similar dramas were playing out across Nazi Germany and occupied Europe. Thousands of individuals faced moments when they had to choose between compliance and conscience, between survival and principle. The story of Franz Kaufmann, a Catholic priest in Munich, illustrates how religious faith motivated resistance even when the cost was everything. Father Kaufmann had served his parish for 20 years when the Nazis came to power, and he initially tried to navigate the new political reality by focusing on spiritual rather than political matters. But as Nazi policies became more extreme, Father Kaufmann found it impossible to remain silent. When the regime began forcibly sterilizing disabled individuals, he preached sermons condemning the practice as a violation of God's will. When Jewish families in his parish were targeted for deportation, he offered them sanctuary in his church and helped several families escape to Switzerland. The Gestapo warned Father Kaufmann repeatedly to restrict his activities to purely religious matters and stop interfering with government policies. He responded by intensifying his resistance activities, reasoning that his religious duties required him to protect the vulnerable regardless of government orders. In 1943, the Gestapo arrested Father Kaufmann during Sunday Mass, dragging him from the altar in front of his horrified congregation. The dramatic nature of the arrest was deliberate. The Nazis wanted to send a clear message to other clergy about the consequences of resistance. Father Kaufmann was sent to Dachau concentration camp, where he joined hundreds of other clergy who had been imprisoned for opposing Nazi policies. The conditions at Dachau were designed to break the spirits of educated, principled men like Father Kaufmann. He was forced to perform hard labor, denied adequate food and medical care, and subjected to constant harassment from guards who had been trained to view clergy as enemies of the state. But Father Kaufmann refused to break. He continued to conduct religious services in secret, counsel fellow prisoners, and maintain his faith despite the horrors surrounding him. When offered release in exchange for signing a statement promising to support Nazi policies, he refused. Father Kaufmann died at Dachau in January 1945, just months before the camp was liberated by Allied forces. His death certificate listed the cause as pneumonia, but fellow prisoners reported that he had been systematically weakened by overwork, inadequate food, and deliberate medical neglect. The congregation he had served in Munich never forgot his sacrifice. After the war, they erected a memorial in their church, honoring his resistance to Nazi tyranny. But the memorial also serves as a reminder of how many other acts of individual resistance were never documented, never remembered, and never honored. No group in Nazi Germany faced the choice between compliance and conscience more consistently than Jehovah's Witnesses. Their religious beliefs forbade them from participating in Nazi rituals, serving in the military, or pledging loyalty to any earthly government. This put them in direct conflict with a regime that demanded total submission from all citizens. The case of the Kusserow family in Paderborn illustrates both the courage and the tragedy of this community's resistance. Franz and Hilda Kusserow had raised their 11 children as devout Jehovah's Witnesses, teaching them that their ultimate loyalty belonged to God rather than to any human authority. When the Nazis came to power, the Kusserow family faced immediate pressure to abandon their faith and conform to Nazi expectations. The children were expelled from school for refusing to give the Hitler salute or participate in Nazi youth organizations. Franz lost his job as a postal worker because he wouldn't join Nazi-affiliated professional organizations. The family could have ended their persecution at any time simply by signing a document renouncing their faith and pledging loyalty to the Nazi state. This document, known as a Declaration of Renunciation, was offered to all imprisoned Jehovah's Witnesses as a way out of the concentration camp system. The document was brief and straightforward. I hereby declare that I recognize the teachings of the Bible students, Jehovah's Witnesses, spread by the International Bible Students Association, to be error, and turn away from this organization completely. I also declare that I will never again participate in the International Bible Students Association. Any persons approaching me with the teaching of the Bible students, I will denounce immediately to the state police. I will in the future esteem the laws of the state. Especially in the event of war, will I serve the fatherland with weapon in hand and join in every patriotic activity. For most Jehovah's Witnesses, signing this document was unthinkable. It would require them to renounce their fundamental beliefs, betray their fellow believers, and pledge to participate in activities that violated their religious principles. The vast majority chose imprisonment, and often death, rather than sign. The Kusserow family's ordeal began in earnest in 1936, when the Gestapo arrested Franz for conducting illegal religious meetings. He was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where guards offered him the Declaration of Renunciation on a daily basis. He never signed. One by one, the Kusserow children were arrested as they came of age and refused to comply with Nazi demands. Wilhelm, the eldest son, was arrested in 1937 for refusing to work in a munitions factory. Karl Heinz was arrested in 1938 for distributing religious literature. Wolfgang was arrested in 1939 for refusing military service. Each arrest followed the same pattern. The young man would be offered the chance to renounce his faith and gain immediate freedom, and each would refuse. They were then sent to concentration camps where the offer was repeated regularly, often accompanied by torture and other forms of pressure. The women in the family faced their own forms of persecution. Hilda Kusserow was repeatedly arrested for continuing to practice her faith and teach it to her younger children. She spent years in various prisons and camps, always refusing to sign the Declaration of Renunciation. The younger Kusserow children were removed from their parents' custody and placed in reform schools designed to break their religious convictions and turn them into loyal Nazi supporters. These institutions used a combination of indoctrination, punishment, and isolation to try to force children to abandon their parents' beliefs. But the most devastating blow to the family came when the older sons were drafted into military service. 5 of the Kusuro brothers were called up for military duty between 1939 and 1943. All 5 refused to serve, citing their religious beliefs about the sanctity of life and their refusal to participate in warfare. The Nazi military justice system was brutally efficient in dealing with conscientious objectors. The brothers were court-martialed, sentenced to death, and executed within weeks of their refusal to serve. Karl Heinz was shot by firing squad in 1940. Wilhelm was executed in 1942. Wolfgang managed to survive in Dachau concentration camp until the end of the war, but he was the only one of the 5 brothers to do so. By the end of the war, the Kusuro family had been almost completely destroyed by their refusal to compromise their religious principles. The parents had spent years in concentration camps, 4 sons had been executed, and the younger children had been traumatized by years in Nazi reform institutions. When Wolfgang Kusuro was interviewed decades after the war, he was asked whether his family's sacrifice had been worth it. His response was immediate and definitive. "We kept our integrity before God. That was worth everything." The Nazi euthanasia program, which began in 1939 with the systematic murder of disabled children and adults, presented medical professionals throughout Germany with an unprecedented moral crisis. Doctors and nurses who had sworn to preserve life were being asked to participate in its systematic destruction. The program, known officially as Action TVR, was presented to medical professionals as a merciful way to end the suffering of people whose lives were deemed not worth living. Disabled individuals, mentally ill patients, and others judged to be burdens on society were to be given mercy deaths, to spare them continued suffering and spare their families continued hardship. Most medical professionals complied with the program's requirements. They filled out the forms identifying patients for treatment, participated in the selection processes that determined who would live and who would die, and either actively participated in the killing process or remained silent about what they knew was happening. But some refused. Dr. Gottfried Ewald, a prominent neurologist at the University of Göttingen, was one of the first medical professionals to openly oppose the euthanasia program. When Nazi officials asked him to serve on the committee that would evaluate disabled patients for treatment, he refused and resigned from his university position in protest. Dr. Ewald's refusal was particularly significant because of his professional stature. He was internationally respected in his field, had trained many of Germany's younger neurologists, and had written textbooks that were used throughout German medical schools. His opposition to the euthanasia program carried weight that the resistance of less prominent doctors might not have had, but Dr. Ewald's resistance came at a heavy price. His refusal to cooperate with the euthanasia program effectively ended his career in Nazi Germany. He was excluded from medical conferences, his research funding was cut off, and younger doctors were warned against associating with him. By 1941, he had been forced into early retirement and lived under constant surveillance. Even more dramatic was the resistance of Pastor Friedrich von Bodelschwingh, who directed the Bethel Institution for Disabled Individuals near Bielefeld. Bethel was one of Germany's largest facilities for people with developmental disabilities and mental illness, housing over 3,000 patients when the Nazi regime came to power. In 1940, Nazi officials arrived at Bethel with transportation lists and orders to transfer hundreds of patients to treatment facilities. Bodelschwingh knew exactly what this meant. These patients were being selected for murder at euthanasia centers. His response was immediate and absolute. He refused to allow any patients to be taken from Bethel. The confrontation that followed lasted for hours. Nazi officials threatened Bodelschwingh with arrest, prosecution, and the forcible closure of his institution. He responded that he would rather die than participate in the murder of innocent people. He told the officials that every person in his care was created in God's image and would remain under his protection regardless of government orders. The Nazi officials eventually retreated, but they returned weeks later with larger forces and legal orders that even Bodelschwingh couldn't resist. However, his initial resistance had bought time that allowed some patients to be hidden or transferred to safer locations. More importantly, his defiance demonstrated that even Nazi officials could be deterred by determined moral opposition. Dr. Karl Bonhoeffer, father of the famous theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, took a different approach to resistance. As one of Germany's most prominent psychiatrists, he was repeatedly asked to participate in the euthanasia program, by evaluating patients and certifying them as suitable for treatment. Dr. Bonhoeffer never directly refused these requests, but he systematically subverted them. When asked to evaluate patients, he would submit reports that were so vague and non-committal that they were useless for selection purposes. He would describe patients' conditions in technical language that made it impossible to determine whether they met the criteria for euthanasia. He would delay his evaluations for weeks or months, claiming that proper assessment required extended observation. This bureaucratic resistance was less dramatic than outright refusal, but it was often more effective. Dr. Bonhoeffer's tactics saved dozens of lives while avoiding the direct confrontation that would have led to his own arrest and replacement by a more compliant doctor. The cost of Dr. Bonhoeffer's resistance was isolation and professional marginalization. Colleagues began to avoid him, knowing that association with him might bring unwanted attention from Nazi authorities. His research projects were canceled, his invitations to conferences stopped coming, and his influence within the German psychiatric community gradually diminished. But perhaps the most heartbreaking case of medical resistance involved Dr. Elisabeth Hecker, a pediatrician who worked at a children's hospital in Vienna after the German annexation of Austria in 1938. Dr. Hecker was asked to participate in the children's euthanasia program, which targeted disabled infants and young children for mercy killing. The program was presented to medical professionals as a compassionate response to the suffering of severely disabled children. Parents were told that their children would receive special treatment at designated facilities, and they were assured that everything possible would be done to help their children lead normal lives. Dr. Hecker knew this was a lie. She had learned from colleagues what actually happened at these special treatment facilities. Children were systematically murdered through starvation, overdoses of medication, or other methods designed to appear natural. When she was asked to identify children from her hospital for transfer to these facilities, Dr. Hecker faced an impossible choice. Outright refusal would result in her immediate dismissal and arrest, but compliance would make her complicit in the murder of children she had sworn to protect. She chose a middle path that was both heroic and tragic. Dr. Hecker began altering medical records to make disabled children appear healthier than they actually were, hoping to keep them off the selection lists. She also began quietly counseling parents about the true nature of the special treatment programs, warning them to refuse transfers for their children. But Dr. Hecker's resistance was discovered in 1941 when Nazi officials noticed discrepancies between her reports and those of other doctors who had examined the same children. She was arrested, charged with sabotage and treason, and sentenced to death. Dr. Hecker was executed in March 1942, but not before writing a letter to her family that revealed both her courage and her despair. She wrote that she couldn't live with herself if she had participated in the murder of children, but she also expressed profound sadness that her resistance had saved so few lives. Her letter concluded with words that capture the moral complexity faced by all those who resisted Nazi policies. "I know that what I did was right, but I also know that it was not enough. The system is too powerful, too thorough, too evil for individual resistance to stop it. But perhaps our refusal to participate will be remembered, and perhaps it will inspire others to choose conscience over convenience when they face their own moments of decision." The stories of those who refused to comply with Nazi demands reveal patterns that transcended individual circumstances and personal backgrounds. Whether they were shipyard workers like August Landmesser, university professors like Kurt Huber, or teenagers like Helmut Hubener, resistors shared certain characteristics that made their defiance possible. Most importantly, they possessed moral frameworks that transcended political loyalty and social conformity. Whether derived from religious faith, philosophical principles, or basic human decency, these frameworks provided standards for judging government actions that were independent of government authority. These resistors also shared a willingness to accept personal sacrifice for moral principles. They understood that resistance would cost them comfort, security, and often their lives. But they chose conscience over convenience when faced with impossible decisions. But perhaps most significantly, these individuals refused to accept the Nazi regime's claim that ordinary people had no choice but to obey government orders. They demonstrated that choice always existed, even under the most oppressive circumstances, and that individuals could maintain moral agency even when surrounded by systematic evil. The cost of their resistance was enormous. August Landmesser lost his family and his life. Sophie Scholl was executed at 21. Helmut Hubener was murdered at 16. Dr. Elizabeth Hecker died for refusing to participate in the murder of children. The Kusarow family was scattered and destroyed by their religious convictions, but their resistance also accomplished something that the Nazi regime couldn't destroy. It preserved the possibility of moral choice in circumstances designed to eliminate it. Every act of refusal, no matter how small, demonstrated that the regime's power wasn't absolute, and that human dignity could survive even systematic attempts to destroy it. The photograph of August Landmesser, with his arms crossed in that crowd of Nazi supporters, continues to challenge viewers across the decades, because it captures this fundamental truth about human nature and political resistance. In a sea of raised hands, one man chose to keep his arms at his side, proving that conformity is always a choice rather than an inevitability. His story, and the stories of thousands like him, remind us that ordinary people possess extraordinary power to resist evil when they choose to exercise it. The cost may be everything we hold dear, but the alternative, surrendering our humanity to preserve our comfort, extracts an even higher price from our souls and our societies. In the end, that may be his most important legacy, not as a symbol of successful resistance, but as a reminder that the choice to resist always exists, and that making that choice, regardless of the consequences, is what separates human beings from the systems that seek to control and dehumanize them. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.